Hello, Kim Dodsworth, Queensland storyteller, with another short story of quality just for you. It's been contributed to our program by Arnold Sinnamon of Queensland. It's from his book entitled Some Down Under Tales. Today's tale is called simply Thanks. It brings back a time when horses were the mainstay of Australian agriculture and bushrangers roamed the hills. Now, that's a romantic setting if ever I heard one. Listen to Thanks by Arnold Sinnamon. And we say thanks too for a great story.
Could pick up lumps of gold. How gold dust lay in every street, and miners' rights were free. Hurrah, said I, me love and friends, that's just the place for me. With me swag upon my shoulder.
Grandmother was famous for her hospitality, and Grandad for his love of horses. No one who called it the Gums ever left without a meal, or at least a cup of tea, and if he came on horseback, there'd be water for the horse and a crust of bread as well. Horsepower was the thing in their day, of course. There was a pony for mustering the dairy herd. There was a harness horse for pulling the spring cart with cream to the railway station. On Sundays, it'd take the sulky to the church. There were also several draft horses for dragging implements to till the soil. By the time I came on the scene, the uncle who worked the farm had bought a tractor. But Grandad still kept two old Clydesdales to look at and talk to, really, and pamper for their past services. We visited my grandparents fairly regularly on Sunday afternoons when the other guests had left. Grandad would have his postprandial snooze, and he'd be resting on his cane settee on the back veranda, looking over his green fields to the river. He'd read a lot in his lifetime, but in later years his eyesight had deteriorated and he'd given it up. He asked me to read for him from the newspaper once when I was about 10 years of age, and this became a regular duty for me. "You're my link with what's happening," he'd say to me. "Without your efforts, I'd live in the past." But the chore was equally rewarding for me. Sometimes an item of news would remind him of an incident from earlier times, and he'd relate the anecdote for my benefit. My mother was inclined to believe there was an element of inventiveness in his stories. I never did. For me, they were an escape from the rather harsh reality of those war years into the colourful and serene times of the past. For all the difference in our ages, these sessions became a regular enjoyment for us both. His best story came after I read an article to him about a bank robbery at Woolloongabba in Brisbane. The culprits had made a large haul, but had been caught in their getaway car at a police roadblock, about 10 miles south of the city. "If I wanted to escape from the police," said Grandad, "I'd rather be on a horse." Then he launched into the story. One evening, long ago, after they'd put the children to bed, he and Sarah, my grandmother, were alerted by the barking of the dogs. James opened the back door, and Sarah took down the shotgun according to their usual routine for night visitors. By moonlight, James saw a figure standing at the yard gate and a horse tethered to the fence. He took a hurricane lamp and went down the steps. "Hello," he said as he approached the stranger. "I need a bed for the night and some tucker for the mare," said the man. "Can you oblige me?" "To be sure," said James. "Wait a moment." He walked back to the foot of the steps and called quietly to Sarah. "It's a traveller who needs a bed. Can you heat up some food for him?" As she nodded assent, he returned to the stranger. "Bring the horse with me." He led the way across to the stable and took the wooden bar down from across the door, beckoning the man inside. He spoke to the draft horses, and they accepted the presence of the new animal as it walked in. It was given a stall at the other end of the stable from them. James provided some hay and a handful of grain in the feed box. The stranger took down his ground sheet roll from the front of the saddle and unstrapped the saddlebags. He lifted the near side saddle flap, undid surcingle and girth buckles, and took the saddle from the horse's back. He set it down in a corner with the saddle cloth on top. James looked at the horse in the flickering light of the hurricane lamp. It was a magnificent animal, perhaps 17 hands in height. Not the sort of horse you'd find on the average farm, nor a stock horse that a drover might ride. Rather, a thoroughbred long-distance racing animal. Midnight black, with white fetlocks. There was spirit in its eyes, but it was hot and sweaty, and there was plenty of white froth around its flanks. It had done a hard day's work. The stranger produced a cloth and rubbed the horse down, removing the sweat and easing its coat where the saddle had been. "There you are," he said quietly. He took off the bridle, rubbed the horse's nose, and scratched it between the ears. When it was contentedly rummaging in the feed box, he laid the bridle on top of the saddle and was ready to go. The two men put up the rails at the back of the stall. The stranger collected his saddlebags, and they went outside. James closed the door and replaced the bar. They walked across to the house. "Could you use a bit of tucker yourself?" James asked as they mounted the steps. "That'd be great." As they entered the kitchen, James introduced himself. "And this is my wife, Sarah." "Hello," said the stranger. Tom Fisher," and shook hands. Sarah had warmed up the stew and brought out the remains of a gooseberry pie. The kettle was approaching the boil, and she'd soon make the tea. "Going far, Tom?" "Yes, quite a way." "Well, you'd better eat up then." James left the kitchen, taking the lantern across the veranda to the small room at the other side, which sometimes served as a bedroom. He moved a pile of empty bags off the bed, checked that there was a pillow and blankets, and left the lantern on the chest of drawers, turning the flame down a little. Mr. Fisher, who was obviously tired, had eaten hungrily, with little to say. But as he finished, he complimented Sarah on a nice meal and thanked her for her trouble. "You get a good night's rest now," said Sarah. James showed him to the spare room and wished him good night. In the morning, James seemed to stir a little earlier than usual. Perhaps it was the movement of the dogs under the steps, but he rose anyway. He walked to the window and looked out. The moon was setting in the west, and the last stars of the cross were blinking palely on the horizon. He dressed quietly and pulled on his boots. Then he headed for the kitchen to light the fire. When he reached the veranda, the cool air struck his face. In the east, there was the suggestion of a glow where the sun would rise in an hour or so. Then he noticed that the door to the spare room was open. He looked inside, but the stranger was gone. In the kitchen, there was a piece of paper on the table with a note which said simply, "Thank you." It was weighted down with a gold sovereign. About mid-morning, as he was harnessing the drafts, James noticed two mounted policemen crossing the creek. They splashed through, then spurred their horses up the rise and reined abruptly as they reached him. "Seen that rogue Starlight?" one of them demanded. "Bush ranger and horse thief," panted the other. "Wanted in both colonies. Riding a black racer with white fetlocks." James stroked the nose of the nearest horse. It was being held in check with a Pelham bit, a type which James thought put unnecessary leverage on the horse's jaw. "Sorry I can't help you," he said. "You're the first blokes I've seen on horseback for a few days. We're a bit away from the road, you see." "Damn," said the first man. "There's a trough for your horses," said James. "Would they like some grain, do you think?" "No time for that," said the second policeman. They spurred their mounts to a canter and headed for the main road. Grandfather shifted a little in his settee as he finished the story. "As far as we were concerned," he said, "Tom Fisher, or Captain Starlight, if that was his identity, was a gentleman who had paid his way and been very correct and pleasant. And anyway, I've enough Irish blood in me not to go tattling to the police." He chuckled away to himself, but it was enough to bring me back to reality. I'd been cantering along a white road in the moonlight on a black racer with white fetlocks. He really was a wonderful storyteller. I rose to go. "When will you read to me again?" he asked. "We can't be here next Sunday," I said, "but I'll see you the week after." "I'll miss you," he said. "Till Sunday week, then." Grandad died rather suddenly at 93 years of age of a heart attack. He'd tried to straighten a gatepost with a crowbar and shovel, and had overdone things a bit. I would have been out to read to him in a few days, but I went to his funeral instead. I followed my father up the aisle of the little church to where he lay in an open coffin. He looked much as he often had done when asleep on the cane settee, with his hands resting on his chest, only this time he was confined within the walls of the polished wooden box. I realized the finality of this sleep later when the undertakers placed the lid of the coffin over him and tightened down the screws. He didn't leave much behind him in the way of worldly possessions, except the farm. That was sold as part of the estate and didn't bring a great deal. The proceeds were divided among his many descendants, and that was about the end of the family's connections with the romantic past. Except for one thing, I guess, which was given to me by grandmother about a fortnight after the funeral. It was in a brown paper bag with my name on it. "Papa wanted you to have this," she said. I opened the bag and found a small leather purse containing a gold sovereign and a fragile piece of paper, browning and burred at the edges with a message. "Thank you," it said.